1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. All right. So that works now? Oh, very good. Oh, very good. All right. Shh. Even I can hear myself now. Okay, well, the reason I do that is I have the kind of voice that puts some people to sleep. So that's how I can gauge who's likely to fall asleep. And you know the name of the person next to you, so you can tell them to wake up. Okay, onward. So what we're looking at is an energy system in transition, as Alf referred to, and looking at some real on-the-ground effects based on a case history of the social and economic effects that occurred during coal seam gas development in the Darling Downs. So we started looking at the Western Downs local government area. We looked eastward of that at Toowoomba, westward at Roma, and we looked up north into the Isaac local government area where Arrow has a little bit of CSG development. So there you go, that's where we're looking. And there are the sizes of some of the towns, very rough sizes. I think these are district populations, so the town and the surrounding population. And so you get the idea that these are small towns. That's where resource development tends to occur in developed countries. They don't do it in the middle of the city, unless it's Texas. They tend to do it out where fewer people live. So the impetus for our project was to measure, understand, and enable people in the region, enable industry, enable state and local government to respond to the changes occurring. So for those of you who haven't been out there, this is what it looks like. And those CSG wells and the tracks there, that's from the early stages of development, when they just cut their tracks right across the landscape instead of putting them out in the margins of the farmers' fields. So the question is, where are these communities coming from? What was happening previously? What was happening at the same time? There was an extended drought and then a flood just as the CSG construction took off. And then where are they headed and how can they get there? So what the community saw during the construction process, the pipes went in first, the big pipelines and the network of pipes that would be connecting to the wells. Although there were some exploration wells that had gone in previously. And housing for the people, the workers, the contractors, tier 2, 3, and 4 contractors, brand new Woolworths, and a 24-hour-a-day McDonald's. Civilization has arrived. So we were, when we began the project a little over 4 years ago, we were pushed by the state government to look at town-level statistics. They said they lacked that granularity. If you look at the regional level, things tend to average out a bit, and you don't see where the impacts and benefits are occurring and where the burdens are occurring, at least geographically. So Queensland Department of State Development, Infrastructure and Planning, and the Government Statistician's Office said we need the granularity at the town level. The towns have different histories and different identities, so why lump them together? That's the political basis of the town, and that's the experience base of the individuals in the region. So if you want your information to be credible to people who live out there, you have to be telling a story they recognize. In addition, the distribution of impacts and benefits is going to be different in different towns, and there will be a migration of impacts from one town to another. There was also resentment of local government amalgamation that occurred about 7 years ago when each of the towns used to have its own local government and then it became a regional government. So one local stakeholder said 3 things that hit them: drought, local government amalgamation, and CSG development. So these were the big things on their radar screen. So the challenge for us in looking at the social and economic effects was, how do we take the things that the community engagement staff in the companies and people in local government and local stakeholders all knew about, but it was a bit of hand-waving and fragmented information, so kind of the airy-fairy, this is how people are feeling, and turn it into something that's so simple and clear that even an engineer can understand it. So we were looking at perceptions of change versus evidence of change in terms of statistical evidence, as well as really credible testimony from people who should know what's going on. So we arrived at agreed indicators, like population, crime rate, housing costs, unemployment. So we looked through studies the government had done, we looked through the social impact assessments the companies had done, and we said, what are the things they're measuring in common? Came up with about 20 indicators, and then we took that to government, industry, and community, said if we took one of those 300-page reports that covers these 20 indicators, and we had to condense it to 6 PowerPoint slides, what would be the 6 indicators that show up on those slides? Government ignored us because the Newman government had just been elected. The companies ignored us because they were too busy putting pipes in the ground, and the community gave us some priorities. And as I alluded to, they said population, unemployment, income, crime rates, and housing costs. That's what we arrived at. We're happy to change those indicators, but these are the ones agreed on. And unless you have that agreement from your stakeholders, there's no reason they should believe the statistics that you're showing them. So you have to bring people along. It's a strategy called shared measurement. So again, as I said, we looked at government reports on these kind of standard areas in which these indicators fall. And we applied a lens of complex adaptive systems and the notion of wicked problems. Problems that they change from day to day. It's hard to identify cause and effect. The solution you come up with, if it worked yesterday, it won't work tomorrow. There's a characterization in the academic literature about these wicked problems, who are saying, it's so complicated, you're not going to be able to model it very readily or in a way that's going to be very believable over time. So we're going to combine different sources of information and triangulate in order to tell the story. So what you end up with is, clear set of indicators, and we start drawing cause and effect relationships, you end up with a very complex diagram of what affects what else. And we drew those causal relationships based on what the literature said, like when unemployment drops, people migrate into the region. When housing costs go up, low-income people migrate out of the region. And we combined that with what key stakeholders were telling us. So we did about 10 interviews of 10 key stakeholders in each community. That could be the mayor, head of the Chamber of Commerce, a significant real estate agent, owner of the local pub, somebody running a social service agency, to say what's actually going on here, what are the cause and effect relationships you're seeing. And by combining that with our statistics, we could tell a big picture story and begin to understand the town as a system and the region as a system. So what were the cumulative social and economic effects? So looking at the Western Downs as we did originally in the first 3 years, we picked up a growth in diversity. Cultural diversity in the people who lived there, a diversity in skills, new skills being brought to the area, at least during the construction phase, growth and diversity of retail, more chic cafes and things like that, and a growth in the diversity of housing, moving from the traditional 3-bedroom house to more modern-looking subdivision-type houses. Some houses might be 4 or 5 bedrooms with an ensuite in each bedroom, built for the contractors to live in. We saw a difference between the expectations of benefits and burdens and where they actually fell. There had been these social impact assessments, lots of consultation in the region, people going up to the Emerald region, say, what happens during a mining boom? But still, people's expectations were not met. Things happened differently. One fellow was telling me a few weeks ago, the upturn and the downturn after the end of the construction phase were much quicker than they expected. They had expected the rate that you get with mining, a bit of an upsweep and then a downsweep over several years. So when you think about that, with all the briefings and all the information provided, if you remember being at university, the average mark in a subject is 70%. That means when you're assessed on only those things that your lecturer considers to be most important, you leave that subject, much less university, where 1 in every 3 things you think you know is wrong, and you don't know which one. So you're trying to educate people in the same way. It should come as no surprise that the expectations and the outcomes are different. The big thing we found was the level of movement. People were moving into the region for work or to open a business or to buy somebody else's business. They were moving out of the region because it was too expensive or because it was expensive. That the price of houses went up. Retired people who had been sitting on their house that hadn't been growing in value much because of the there wasn't a big increase in population. There was a prolonged drought, would repress the price of houses. So the price of their house went up, they sold up and retired to the coast. So you had a pent-up demand for selling houses and a demand for buying houses, so people left. People moved within the region in order to get closer to the work or go to farther from the work. We were told with low-income people what they do is they move to escape the high rents. They also moved to make sure they were more than 50 kilometers away from the local Centrelink office. If you're more than 50 kilometers away, you don't have to come into the office to pick up your check. So you have all of these movements driven by a range of these different pressures. So we're not calling it migration because it's a different kind of movement. You also had people driving in from out of the region. The number of you'll see shortly, the number of small businesses that filed tax returns in Kingaroy rose dramatically because it's 2 hours drive from Chinchilla. The rents in Kingaroy did not rise. People lived in Kingaroy and drove in for the work, and then they drove home. So when you have a lot of movement and you have a lot of intense activity, what gets hurt are the social ties and trust, what's called social capital. And social capital can decline when people don't have time to interact, and it can decline when the people who are pivotal in the networks in the community leave. So when some of the older people left, selling up their houses and leaving, it may not have been the volume of older people leaving, it may have been that specific individuals left who were pivotal in the community. So social capital declined. You had winners and losers, a two-speed economy. Those being paid by the CSG industry and earning money from it, and those who are in other kinds of businesses, teaching, healthcare, where their wages stayed the same. You had new faces in town, people you weren't used to seeing before, and you had transients, people coming and going. You might not know who your neighbors were, because your neighbor had moved out, so they could rent their house and make a lot of money, and then in a few years they would move back. So you decline in social capital. And so through our analysis, can we figure out what you can do to build that social capital again? How can you use the new connections and the new people in the region, the new skill sets, in order to build that social capital that's going to contribute to the economic prosperity of the region? Because small businesses rely on people knowing each other. A business owner needs to know their suppliers and their customers as well as their staff base. And that's what helps small businesses to thrive. So social ties and trust and social capital. So the literature on resource boom towns goes back a number of decades. And psychologist Gilmore, I believe he may have even written this for the magazine Science, which doesn't publish a lot of social science, on boom towns. And he identified what he saw as a triangle through which when the population increases rapidly, it can outrun the ability of the services in the community to service the people who are there. And you can end up with a degraded quality of life. So when things settle down, people don't want to live there. And you can look at some of the communities in North Dakota, like Williston, and you can determine whether long-term, what's the new normal? Are people feeling better off, or more people in the area, or fewer, or have things gone the other way? So the threshold they identified, and so in a complex adaptive system, that's what you look for, is a threshold. When are things going to change dramatically? The threshold that studies have identified is if the population in the region grows between 5 and 15% a year, things start to go a bit wonky. And so that's what we're going to be looking for. In our data, when was the population growing at that rate? So in looking at our key indicators, when you look at the town population, you can see in a number of years in there, the population, if you included the non-resident workers who were living in the work camps, rose more than 5% in several of those years in a number of those towns. So that would put a stress on local businesses and local services. And the companies compensated. They would provide health care to the workers in the camps, less stress on the local healthcare providers. Unemployment levels took a roller coaster ride. I'll show you a more detailed chart of that shortly, because you had the resources boom in Queensland, the global financial crisis hit Queensland and Australia, you had the drought occurring, and then you had the CSG development occurring, and then the end of the construction boom in CSG, and that gave you some ups and downs. Big complaints in the communities about the level of traffic with all the trucks coming in and the contractors. So the police paid attention to that. So we looked at the number of traffic infractions recorded in various years, and when the police pay attention, the number goes up. It doesn't necessarily mean 50% more people are driving fast, it means the police are paying 50% more attention and they're stopping people. The companies were putting in computer monitoring equipment into their vehicles. So I think by about 2014, all of the CSG company vehicles, and probably the tier 1 contractors, had computer monitoring equipment that told you how fast they're driving, where they're driving, and things like that. So that cut down the traffic infractions of the company vehicles. But then you're left with the tier 2, 3, and 4 contractors who don't have that equipment. And so a lot of the finger pointing is at the contractors. The irony being, when you have this sort of development in the region, they say for every person employed in the industry, you get between 2 and 5 additional jobs. So in the one thing, you talk in glowing terms about that multiplier effect, but when it comes to certain impacts, you point the finger at these people, this multiplier effect. These are the people who are causing some of the challenges, some of the burdens in the community. As I alluded to before, rents went up dramatically. They nearly tripled in some of the small towns. The contractors needed places to live. The workers, the CSG workers and tier 1 contractors lived in camps, but the rents went up dramatically anyway. And that drove out fixed income and low income individuals and families. Income went up. The income data is delayed because the Australian Taxation Office takes a couple of years to go through their figures. But you can see there have been upticks in our data. You can see there have been upticks in personal income in these communities. There are 2 ways you get an increase in income. One is people get paid more. The other is you chase out the people with low income because these are averages. And so when you take out the low numbers, the average goes up. So it's a combined effect there. In terms of crime rates, there were good order offenses in the early years, and some of the stories are the people who came in with the CSG industry started hitting on the girlfriends of the guys who lived in the communities, and there were some dust-ups. I'm sure there were other things that board workers were doing when they were having a bit to drink. The liquor accord was invoked, which was something that was put into the legislation about 100 years ago, maybe a bit longer. And that's where the pub owners, the police, and the companies can get together and put certain restrictions on drinking and where people can hang out. So that was a positive adaptive strategy that cut down on what are called good order offenses, people having fights. Drug offenses went up. Again, this was blamed on the contractors. If you look at the economics, basically what happens is when there is resource development, drug use goes up because there are people there who can pay for the drugs, and there are ways for the drug dealers to get in and out of the region without being noticed very much. There was opportunistic theft. You had a lot of new white utes with nice driving lights and expensive tools in them, and so there were people around who said, here's a resource that I can extract from the region. So you saw a climb in certain crime rates and then a decline, but now in recent years you're seeing a real uptick in drug crimes. So if we look at that median weekly rent, again, this is in the Western Downs, these are the towns, this is roughly how large they are, those are the town center populations, there's the Queensland average, and you always need a trend line, what's happening long term, and you need a baseline or something to refer it to, a benchmark that tells you, is this unusual? Kogan Creek Power Station, a $1.3 billion investment went in over a 2-year period. Rents in Chinchilla went from, it looked like $135 on up to $300 a week. That's quite a substantial rent. So the leases tend to be 1 year, and the rent can be raised every 3 months. So it's a kind of a factor that responds very quickly when there are economic changes in the community. And you can see the curve right after Kogan Creek goes in, it drops a little below normal, and then it comes back and it resumes its historic trend. And the CSG construction projects, and you can see the rent boosts that went in there, and the smaller towns felt the rent boost more. A town like Dalby, the blue line, you saw less of a shift. This is a rent on 3-bedroom houses. Anecdotally, somebody's alluded to the fact that the rent for older retired people had been affected fairly significantly. We did not look at the rents on apartments and units, but we have the option to go in and look at that data and to see whether did that really spike in Dalby. The reason we chose 3-bedroom houses rather than all rental property is we wanted people to be able to walk up to a real estate agent's front window, look in the window and see the same numbers we were reporting. The more you aggregate things, the more detached they become from the things you can see every day. So what we use the interviews and we use the statistical data to look at the myths. And myths are made up of experiences, information, hearsay, inference, and invention. Often there's a grain of truth, and we've developed a way of using our data, our statistics, to go in and figure out where is that truth, where is that impact occurring, where is it not occurring. And to look at impacts and differentiate between the proximate cause and the ultimate cause. When there are a lot of white Utes driving through a community, people will blame the changes on the CSG development. The ultimate cause may be the result of years of drought and other factors, like the migration of older people out of the region. They'd been waiting. There was that pent-up demand to sell their house, and so when the prices rose, they all moved. Was it caused by CSG development, or was it, could you say it might have been triggered, a pent-up demand, something waiting to happen? So an example of one myth, small shops have closed as customers moved down. The lower socioeconomic residents left to avoid the high rents. And that was happening, and we've picked that up in our statistical analysis. But in individual cases, the shop owner had been aiming to sell for years, and the price was right. During the CSG construction boom, people wanted to buy businesses where the action was, and the prices went up. Another shop owner was unable to retain staff with the wages offered because they could get paid more in the CSG industry. So they just closed up shop. So there's a whole range of different reasons why certain shops may have closed. And if you look at the statistics on the number of businesses in these communities, you'll see that this number of businesses climbed dramatically during the CSG construction period. So it's not that businesses were closing. A lot of these may have been individual contractors, filing a tax return. That's where statistics on number of businesses come from. So there's vitality there and a lot of economic activity, but some shops were closing nonetheless. And you'll see even Kingaroy's on there, the red one on the right with a big spike and the red dropping off there, where again, they're 2 hours away, but you had a lot of people, activating their ABN and filing a tax return, getting some contracting work down in 2 hours away in Chinchilla or elsewhere. You had people in the community saying, it was great during the construction period, our children could stay in town and get jobs. So there were indeed jobs during the boom, but you also had children of farming families called back to help on the farm. Our study of agricultural coexistence, what happens to the operations of a farm when CSG operations are occurring. Some farmers were spending a day a week and more just handling the comings and goings of the CSG contractors. So they called their kids back, said, I need you to help run the farm because I'm now running 2 businesses. And that interrupted the succession plans on the farms. The kids moved back sooner than they wanted to. So when you talk about young people being back in the community and young families, there was some occurring temporarily, there was some occurring for longer term, but there were different causes and different effects. You also had backpackers taking up jobs in the service industry and 457 visa holders. Sometimes the rents were subsidized by the employer, otherwise they couldn't afford the rent in the community. And they were temporary. The question is, how many of them are going to stay in the region? To what extent do you want people there for only a few years and having them leave? So if you look at the unemployment rates, which I showed you the chart before, again, sizes of the towns, there's the Queensland average. There's the resources boom, declining unemployment. And the unemployment in these towns is lower than the Queensland average because people move on and off the farm, and that can confuse the statistics for who counts as employed or unemployed. Additionally, in smaller communities, if you don't have a job, you tend to leave. But if you just look at the shape of the curve, you see a decline as it occurred in Queensland, bottoming out when the global financial crisis hit Australia. You had drought, flood, and then drought. You had CSG development noticed around 2010. It had begun before then, but it was noticed in the communities in 2010. And when you have very low unemployment, you have a skills shortage, and that's when your backpackers and people on 457 visas arrive. So in the long term, you have this complex interplay of factors causing the outcomes that people were seeing. So if you look at recent unemployment, in that between those two vertical red lines is when the CSG construction boom was occurring, and you can see declining unemployment in these communities, even in Tara, which was a town that was economically disadvantaged. CSG work not much CSG work occurred directly around Tara. There was some, I don't know, 10, 15 kilometers away. And then you see subsequent, when the construction boom ended, unemployment in some communities went up. In Queensland, it went down. And so we're looking to see where is the new normal. What's the level of unemployment? What are the number of businesses? What are the income levels? You can also look at the number of wage earners. Remember, it's talking about migration, people moving in and out. So you can see at the top, it's Dalby. You can see a big bump in the number of wage earners in Dalby. In some cases, it's people moving to the community. In some cases, it's people who may not have been employed taking on part-time jobs. Could be, you know, spouses, teenagers, that sort of thing. People on the farm who are indeed working, but were not counted as part of the paid workforce. But you see a rise in the number of wage earners and then a decline, less so in Chinchilla and less so in the smaller towns. What you also see here is the larger towns there's finger pointing saying they're getting all the benefits, and the people in the smaller towns are saying, why don't we get more of the benefit? So the bump in the percentage rise seems to be larger in the larger towns. So the big economic gains from CSG development were in Brisbane, the next biggest gains in Toowoomba, next biggest in Dalby, and then on into the smaller communities. There's the aspiration in the region. We want more young families. So as I alluded to, young people returned, then some left, and others were kept in town to help their parents run the farm because the parents had to be dealing with CSG operations. Rents spiked and then crashed because of overbuilding, and there you go. There's the rent in Chinchilla compared to the state average. You have the rise when the Kogan Creek Power Station went in, the rise and the dramatic fall after the CSG construction period ended. So when rents like that fall, low-income families can move in, and we have some more statistics on that. Now the problem is when the rents fall, you had a number of houses built by speculators in Melbourne, who sent their money up to somebody who convinced them this was a boom area with huge rents, and you had people defaulting on mortgages. So although the sale price of houses might drop, the willingness of the banks to loan money for you to buy a house drops. They redline the area because there are people defaulting on their mortgages. So the local people and the young people may be able to pay the mortgage, but they have to come up with a much higher down payment. So investor mortgage defaults. And if you look at the family to see who's moving into these areas, so this is, what community is that? Chinchilla? And you can see the number of people receiving government payments rose after the CSG construction boom was over. So it suggests that the lower rents were attracting people on low incomes. So it's either two things. One is people stuck around in the towns and then filed for government payments, or people were moving into the community who needed government support. And other data suggests it's indeed people moving into the community. There was one builder who had a bunch of houses and said, if you sign a lease for 2 years, I'll pay 6 months of your rent. So 25% rent decrease. And that's very attractive to people on low incomes. And then you say, okay, well, what kind of families are moving to the area? So these are the enrollments from the My School website for Chinchilla High School and Chinchilla State School. And if you look at Chinchilla State School, a primary school, you have a bit of an uptick in the number of enrollments in 2013 and 14, but haven't changed a whole lot over time. Whereas if you look at Chinchilla High School, you go up, you have what is that, 10%, 50, not 10%, about 8% rise, and then you have about a 20% overall rise in 2 years in the number of students enrolled in the high school. And that's after the CSG construction boom has ended. So somebody's moving to town who has high school kids. Either that or the families can't afford to send them to boarding school. So it could be some combination of the two. Or they started having kids?
During the Kogan Creek boom.
During the Kogan Creek boom. That could be it, yeah. And then we look at some of the downsides, drug offenses. So if you look at this chart, the two vertical red lines, so this show the CSG construction period and a bit of an uptick in some drug-related crimes. You also have, I have the Queensland benchmark in orange, showing a little bit of an upswing in drug crimes. And then you see Miles in the light green, this huge upswing in drug crime. And so the question is, so are those the teenagers who are moving to the area, or is it something else? What we heard in doing a profile about 6 months ago in Wandoan was because QGC was doing some development there, and there had been traditionally complaints about the increase in traffic in the area, the local police were paying attention to traffic and they were stopping people. And what was happening was they were also searching the vehicles. And so they were picking up the local dope heads that had been there for a long time and hadn't been bothering anybody. And so the indications of drug crime went up in Wandoan because of the traffic-related concerns. So the challenge is this new drug crime, old drug crime, police focus, or is it that there's a certain element that's been brought to a community like Miles? Where are those people coming from? And again, using our statistics and interviews, we can dig further and find out some of that information. The police know a lot, and the challenge is for them to make, and they keep statistics, which is really good, and then the challenge is finding cause and effect relationships. And then it gets to, well, with all the CSG construction occurring and the ongoing development, surely the place is benefiting economically, a huge amount of money going into the region. It's very un-Australian to talk about being successful. And so people who run small businesses who make money have ways of investing the money in things that don't show up in their tax return. You know, they legally put the money where you're not going to see it. We have anecdotal evidence to suggest people who are earning money from conduct and some compensation agreements were investing outside the area because of the recent flooding and because of the upswing and the downswing from the CSG construction. They saw the market as a bit volatile. So they were buying a flat for their kids to come to uni or investing somewhere else, buying a place on the coast. So the question is, you have this money in the region, when is it going to be repatriated and when is it going to surface? So this is looking at the average taxable income, and you see around 2011-12 some squiggles. The Australian Tax Office and the ABS changed how they were adding up average taxable income. I think previously they had not counted, or they had counted incomes of 0 or negative, and then in the new averages they don't count them. So that changes things. But if you look at the general shape of the curve, you can see a real climb from the CSG construction period. But remember how I told you the people in Kingaroy were coming into the region for jobs? You can see their income level has dropped. Well, dropped, I think that's because it could be the change in calculations or flooding or something like that, but you're not seeing a similar spike. So there's a story there. Where is this money going? Somebody who knows about taxes said often when a business has a big contract, their gross income may go up, but because they have to deliver on the contract, in the first year they count part of that income as a debt obligation. They have to work it off. So you don't see the rise in income in the first year. So a lot of the squiggles in these curves have to do with how people treat taxes. So you need to interview the people, the tax accountants, to say, what's the real story there? Nonetheless, the data shows, you know, a rise in incomes. And as I said before, when is that money going? When are you going to see that money invested in the region? Some anecdotal evidence suggests more home renovations, that those are beginning to occur, particularly now the construction costs have abated. So again, we get back to the cumulative effects, you know, growth and diversity, difference between expectation of benefits and burdens, where and when and how dramatic, and what actually occurred, and all this movement in and out and these changes in social capital, a decline, winners and losers, new faces and transients, and transparency about what's going to happen in the future, so small businesses can take advantage of whatever reinvestment there's going to be in the region and the ongoing CSG operations, relationship building to rebuild that social capital and take advantage of some of the financial capital that's now in the region, and a reorientation. Where does the region want to go now that there's money amongst a fair number of people in the region? And that's where you can find more data on our website, Boomtown Indicators. There's a toolkit that we developed to enable local businesses, local government, state government, and companies to determine what's going on, to identify what indicators to track, identify where to get the data, and then what to do, how to respond to dramatic changes. And then there's our companion site. We have a toolkit website and an indicators website where you can generate the curves and see what's happening. Takeaway messages: resource development can be seen as a catalyst for change. You look at long-term trends and then what are pent-up demands and things that are about to happen where the development can be a trigger. And you can do a system analysis using the approach that we did, using local data and local voices to find out trends over time and cause and effect relationships. And just thanks to my team. And thanks for the support to the CSG companies, QGC, Santos, Arrow Energy, and APLNG. Thanks for insight from the Queensland government and my contact.
Good. Thank you very much.
Good.
So I'm going to ask the panel members to come down and join. So while we're doing that, again, one of Will's favourite tricks. I can either stand here and go, which is his real favourite.
Right, yes.
Just confirm with the person next to you to come up with a question you're going to ask in a couple of seconds while we mic these guys up. Okay, so just come up with at least one question.
Happy to throw that.
I'll do that. I'll say that. Because you were right at the beginning of this with Santos, weren't you, before they were? Yeah, that's good. Oh, that's right.
Oh, so you know some.
We're not ready.
You know some.
I have mine's not up, that's enough.
Hello.
Okay, so Will you met?
Talk through
No
yours.
one did false things, that's good. Professor Peter Ashworth there is our chair of the Sustainable Energy, correct? Professor. Peter's got a long history of
I don't know who's that. Is it you?
whistling in the microphone.
Mine's not too long because there's too many whistles.
She's got a lot of experience
Okay.
really engaged outreach around contentious technologies. And Rick Wilkinson there is double hatting actually. He's with the APA, with the petroleum industry, and he's also a gas field commissioner. And actually Rick was with us right at the beginning of the CSG course. So I think what I'm going to do just before your questions, I'm just going to ask Rick to pass a brief comment on what we've just heard. Is that right, Rick? Good. It works.
Yes, I think we're all there. The feedback's off. Question from what we heard. Yes, I think often I get a question is, well, what would you do if you started again? How would it be different? And the answer is, I'm not sure I learned a lot on the way through, except that you're dealing with people. That there's not a scientific analysis that says if I did all of these things and ticked all these boxes, I wouldn't have any problems. And I kind of think about a marriage, right? Why don't you do baselining at the marriage and then you'll be happy for the next 40 or 50 years and everything will be great? Well, the answer is things change, people change, and they review that. And so all things about baselining, trying to anticipate what's important to a community over the length of time of CSG of 20 years is almost impossible to do. So those engineers of you think you can get down with a plastic ruler and anticipate what's going to happen in the 20 years, you can't. What you do need to have is a proper dialogue, just in that relationship I spoke about, where you actually can have an ongoing, honest, transparent discussion with your partner or the community that you're working with. And I think the stuff that I saw in Will's data was exactly that. There are a lot of stuff there you couldn't have anticipated, but how do you react to that to keep it on track?
Yeah, I guess, is this one on? Yep. Is that okay? Or not? No? Yes? I'll just hold it. Hang on. I mean, I've been out in some of those communities, and it is interesting when you start to talk to people in this post-resources boom and thinking about some of those houses that were built by the investors. And the local people, for them, the big significant thing when they think about it is actually look at the state of the lawns. you know, these empty houses and nobody cares about them. You know, it sends a strong message. And there is this thing around social capital, yes, it declines, but the other thing that you see when when the enemy comes to town or where's someone that people are not happy, you actually build a social capital with the locals because they've teamed together. And I think that we saw that in a lot of those. So it's around thinking around how do we harness that in a way that has a positive impact? Because although there's this us and them that happens, the social capital, I think, increases by the locals that are left behind in some ways because they band together. But that actually can be a challenge for the dialogue that goes forward. So for me, looking at that, I mean, I wasn't, you know, there's a lot of numbers there, but there's a big challenge for rural Queensland in all different ways, which I think is a different story that plays into this as well, perhaps, and maybe that might come out in some of the questions.
Yeah, I'm going to take questions now. That's okay. Thanks very much, Peter. You were the first off the rank, so
This one's just a sort of a frivolous icebreaker. You were talking about... Sorry? Hello? You were talking about traffic infringements, but one of the things I particularly noticed driving along the Warrego Highway, it wasn't so much bad traffic infringements, it was just heavy traffic and wide loads, and combined with the fact that the flood took out a large section of the Warrego Highway and it was down to 60 kilometres now between Dalby and Toowoomba. Did you look at traffic in that sense as opposed to infringements?
In terms of understanding the context, yeah, it was one of the things I heard very early on in the research. There were two complaints: people drove too fast and people drove too slowly. And there was the flood reconstruction. People said with the additional traffic and the reconstruction of the roads, it took longer to get into Toowoomba or Brisbane. And that was one complaint. But you also had the secondary roads and hundreds of millions of dollars going into repaving and paving secondary roads. And you had people using secondary roads the young blokes and the white utes, you know, the contractors driving too fast, kicking up dust. And the original complaint was dust. And I said, to me, if I'm on a secondary road and somebody speeds past me, it's not the dust I'm worried about. You know, it's the safety issue. So there were, as you know, Peter was referring to, and as Rick was referring to, there's this whole constellation of concerns that go with any one topic.
I might just pick up, given it was by your own admission, the frivolous question. One of the things when we did the baselining, when we started off, we did consult with communities what were concerns. One of them was traffic. And so we spent a lot of time modelling traffic and where it would go and so forth, and that was a very important part of it all. We put, and I think, Will, you spoke about it, these traffic car monitoring systems on board. So every car of every operator, including the prime contractors underneath, had devices installed which tracked where the car was, the speed it was going, how hard it was braking, and so forth. Now, I thought when we first put it on that this would be just to find out who messed up when there was an accident and we could fire the person or not. But what happened was you actually had a precursor as to who was going to have an accident, because you saw the people who accelerated hardest and braked hardest were being picked up. So we actually could sit down and counsel people about not just their accident they had, but the ones they were about to have. And they also were able to exclude certain roads, for example, those which had school buses on them during that period. And you just took you